Well, in the 1950s, there was a psychologist named Solomon Asch, and he conducted an experiment, and it became quite famous because what it revealed about the power that people have to influence others. So he brought a group of college kids into a room, and he showed them two cards. Ashton, I think there's a picture up there for it. On one card was this target line, and on the other card were three lines, one of them matching the target line. And the job of the person was incredibly simple. All they had to do was look at the three lines and say which one matches the target line. So just by a raise of hands, how many of us in here think it's line A? What about line B? What about line C? Okay, we can all see that it is C. There's an obvious answer. However, the person that was being asked the question, there's something they did not know, that every other person in that room was going to intentionally choose the wrong answer. So imagine sitting there, you're looking at this card, the answer is very, very obvious, and then the guy calls on the first person answers wrong. And then the second person answers wrong, and then one after another, everyone is answering the wrong one. And then it comes your choice. Now it's your turn. So you're looking back at the lines have not changed at all. You still see the answer plain as day. But suddenly, something about saying the right answer out loud feels a little bit different. And Ash actually goes on to say what happened. He said the people became very hesitant. They became uncomfortable. Some would pause before answering. Some would speak really quietly. Some even looked embarrassed. But check this out, 53% of the people answered the wrong way to match the answer of everyone else. Think about that. The correct answer didn't change. The only thing that changed was the pressure of giving in and giving a different answer than everyone else. And that's what we're going to see here in our story this morning. We're going to be in Mark 15, and we're going to read about Pontius Pilate. And as the pressure rises from Pontius Pilate, we're going to see 5 different movements of the pressure to please people. So if you have a Bible, please turn to Mark chapter 15. Let's pray. God, I just pray, Lord, that you would give me the words to speak. Lord, I thank you for the time that you and I have had together in preparing the message for this week. And Lord, I just pray that I can communicate it clearly and truthfully and faithful to your word. In your Son's holy and precious name I pray. Amen. So the first thing that we're going to see in this movement is that people-pleasing encounters truth. So we're going to start in Mark 1. We're going to read down to verse 5. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away to be delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. So Jesus has been condemned to death, or the chief priests bring him saying he deserves death. The leaders bind him. They hand him over to Pilate. Now, it's important for us to know that Pilate is the Roman governor. So he is the only one who has the authority to actually hand somebody over or sentence someone over to crucifixion. And Mark names that the chief priests, the scribes, the whole council is there. So the whole weight of the religious establishment has brought Jesus before Pilate. And so Pilate asked Jesus a question. He says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asks it as a political question because Rome takes claims of kingship very, very seriously. And as we go through this passage, you'll see that Mark keeps giving Jesus this title. And yet, despite that title, Jesus here is being treated as a criminal. The man standing before Pilate is still king. And so Jesus answers him, "You have said so." And now all these accusations begin. The chief brings charge after charge after charge, but Jesus makes no answer. That is not what Pilate expects. Pilate expects Jesus to defend himself, because many facing a pretty serious charge like that would do so. They would try to explain their actions or plead for their life, but Jesus does none of that. And Mark tells us that Pilate is amazed. Jesus is silent. And this is unlike anything Pilate has experienced before, especially from someone who has been accused. Now, here's where Pilate encounters something. He encounters something that he cannot easily dismiss. Jesus, the way Jesus is carrying himself, Jesus' composure, does not match the picture that his accusers are making of him. And this is where the pressure to please often begins for us. Because the truth that we know it is clear. And sometimes that truth is so clear that it requires a response from you and I. But once we realize that that truth may disappoint someone, we begin to question it. We say things like, I'm not really sure what to do. But the truth of the matter is, that is simply just an excuse not to act. Because the reality is, we may not want to pay the price of doing the right thing. We know that a difficult conversation needs to happen, but we keep postponing it. Some wrong that has been set against us needs to be addressed, but we're just hoping maybe if we just put it off, the problem will disappear. Maybe you've been asked to participate in something that you know is wrong, but saying no might make the person upset with you. And so when we do that, compromise begins to slip in. And if I think about my years as a teenager, most of the bad decisions I made were a direct result of me trying to please people around me. I compromised my own convictions, even though I wasn't a believer at the time. I knew what was right and what was wrong, but I had this desire to please people. And so when pressure came, I gave into it. And that's the issue that we face sometimes, is that we know what we should do, but we are often afraid of what our obedience might change or what it might change. Maybe the people will misunderstand us. Maybe if we speak truth to what they're saying, maybe they'll laugh at us. Maybe if we confront that person with truth, maybe the relationship will never be the same. Those possibilities hurt. But the truth of the matter is, they hurt because people matter to us. There are moments in my life when fear of losing peace with someone has pulled me away from my peace with God. I don't know if you guys can relate to that, but it's true for me. But I know that God does not promise that my obedience will always be understood. In fact, he says the opposite of that. I know that not everyone is going to agree with me, and yet he calls me to trust him with how they respond. Before their anger, their criticism, before the relationship even changes, my heart and your heart have to settle on one question. And I believe this to be true. Will I obey God even if someone I deeply love will be upset with me as a result? Will I obey God even though someone I love will be upset with me? And so one way that we avoid this is by searching for different ways to resolve the problem without causing conflict with someone. And that's what we're going to see here in our next few verses, which is people-pleasing looks for another way. Now at the feast, he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. Among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas, sorry. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priest had delivered him up. See, this was a custom, this was a tradition that Pilate or the governor would release one prisoner requested by the people. And Mark tells us that there's a man named Barabbas there who is a murderer. So he's not an innocent man. But when the crowd asked Pilate to follow this tradition, Pilate asked them, he says, "Do you want for me to release for you the king of the Jews?" So Pilate is sort of like nudging them, like, that guy, you want me to release the king of the Jews for you? Because Pilate knows, and it says here in the text, that he perceives that envy is the reason why Jesus is standing before them. He knows that their case is not an honest pursuit of justice, that they really just want Jesus removed because Jesus' presence in their life is threatening something in theirs. And the text does not tell us every thought that Pilate has, but there is an order of events. And that order suggests that he sees this prisoner release tradition as a possible way to release Jesus without causing conflict with others. Now, to us, the choice is obvious, right? You have Barabbas, who's a murderer, and you have Jesus, who's claimed to be the king of the Jews, but there's no evidence against him. So maybe Pilate expects the crowd to choose Jesus, because if they do, he'll reach the right result without upsetting anyone. But I don't know if you've ever looked at the story this way, but this should not be a hard decision. This is not some moral conflict that somebody should be wrestling with. Pilate sees no evidence of a crime against Jesus, but it is the opposition that Pilate might face if he doesn't give them what they want. But he appears to be willing to do what is right, but only if the crowd makes it easy. How many of us have ever done that? Because what that teaches us is that is obedience with conditions attached. Because he's searching for a way out, but a way out that won't require him to carry any cost. And we often do the same thing, but we do it in much more quiet and subtle ways. For example, we ask God for another way when the way that he has called us to requires us to be uncomfortable or requires us to have courage. Maybe we keep seeking counsel from other people even after the issue's been resolved, hoping that maybe someone will release us of any responsibility that we may have in the problem. We wait for the perfect moment, but sometimes, and most often, that perfect moment never comes. And these things, they sound good. But what I found in my own prayer time this week is that these are just thoughts that I hide behind. And I use them sometimes to postpone what God has already made clear. The heart is very good at using spiritual language and talk to protect itself. We say things like, "I'm still praying about it," but what we probably mean is, "I don't want to do that yet." We say things like, "I need more advice," but we probably mean, "I'm looking for someone to tell me what I want to hear." Or we say things like, "I'm waiting for the right time," when we may mean, "I'm just hoping that this problem just fades away." These are just ways for us to simply keep delaying our yes. These are just ways for us to delay being obedient. Okay, but here's the consequences. The conversation that needs to happen remains unspoken. And so in your mind, you come up with different motives or assign different motives, and it's he said, she said, and the issue never gets resolved. The responsibility that we have to approach somebody remains untouched. And the person who needs us to be faithful keeps waiting. Those are some of the consequences of people-pleasing. And that leads us to the third thing, is that people-pleasing gives others control. Verse 11 says, "But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, 'Then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews?'" On the surface, this looks like a very repetitive question, and it is, but this question in this context changes this entire scene. Pilate, remember, is the governor. The leaders brought Jesus to him because they need his authority to execute Jesus. The crowd, they cannot issue a sentence, yet Pilate is now asking them to supply the decision. Listen, church, he is not asking them for evidence. He's asking what they want. He says, "What shall I do?" He places the responsibility on them. But he cannot transfer his responsibility. Whatever they demand, no matter what, Pilate is still the man who has to authorize the outcome. Now, responsibility can be shared in some decisions, but you know what can't be shared? Your conscience. Conscience cannot be shared. And what do I mean? Well, suppose you're in a room full of people, and everyone is in agreement. Everyone says the same thing. Everyone is in agreement. But a room full of people who agree does not make an unfaithful choice faithful. And a room full of people who disagree does not make obedience wrong. And this is where people-pleasing, I believe, begins rearranging the authority in the heart. Because Pilate still holds the office, but the crowd's reaction, you'll see, is now beginning to govern him. It's now beginning to sway him. And that can happen to us. We may appear to be making the decision, but inside of us, one person's approval has become sort of the permission that we require before we will act. You know, a boundary is necessary, but you keep moving it because someone becomes upset. You know what you should do, but you know you can't move forward until you know for sure that that person isn't going to be disappointed. See, when we're very good at reading people, we can study people's faces, we can hear their words, and oftentimes we measure our decision by whether that person will remain pleased. And listening is not a weakness. Wise counsel is a gift from the Lord, and correction should be welcomed. But counsel becomes control when another person's approval is something we must have. Not something that we want, but something that we must have. And when you get to that point, you have given a human voice authority in your life that only belongs to God. Galatians 1:10 says, "For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God?" That question does not ask whether we care what anyone thinks. What it's really asking is, whose approval matters most, man's or God's? Whose approval brings you peace, man's or God's? Whose disapproval unravels you, man's or God's? And I am not ignorant. I know that there are people in your life whose disappointment will break your heart. that there are relationships that we desperately want to preserve. And there are voices in our life that matter deeply, but we cannot allow them to become Lord. Obeying God should not depend on whether another person agrees with you. For years, listen, church, for years, some of us have made decisions in our life solely based on the approval of others. And over time, when we do that, we train ourselves to listen to their voices before we seek God's. I mean, for those of you who are in high school, peer pressure is a real thing. And if you're not grounded in your convictions, it's very easy to be swayed by friends who may not have your best interest in mind. And before you know it, you're doing things that you never even imagined you would do. But that is not freedom. That is bondage. And can I just say this, that you and I, we are not responsible to please everyone. We're not responsible to please everyone, but what we are responsible for is to love people, to listen honestly, to examine ourselves. But the most important thing that you and I are called to do is to live a life faithful and obedient to Christ. And sometimes that will disappoint people. And the fourth thing that we're going to see here is that people-pleasing yields to pressure. And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." Now I went and I looked at the original language of this, and when he says why, it is really like a why. Why? What evil has he done? And this is where we see the pressure. Because it's the right question. What evil has this man done? Because there's no guilt. And they ask what crime Jesus has committed. And still the crowd has no answers, no evidence, no argument, just shouts, "Crucify him, crucify him." And he asks about guilt. "Crucify him, crucify him." This is pressure. And the pressure on Pilate is increasing. But you know what pressure can't do? No matter how much pressure someone puts on you, pressure cannot change what is true. Jesus does not become more guilty because the crowd becomes louder. And the text shows us what changes is not the evidence. What changes is the difficulty Pilate is now facing standing against the crowd. Mark says they shouted all the more. And Pilate's question, why, does not slow them down. And why doesn't it slow them down? Because this particular group of people have a very particular outcome they want, and they will keep pressing and pressing and pressing until they get it. And this is where people-pleasing, the pressure of it, begins to wear people down. I'm sure some of you have been there before. Feeling the pressure from people over and over and over again, and finally you just get so worn out. You've already given them the answer, but it just keeps coming and coming and coming. Their anger gets more intense. Maybe they give you the silent treatment, or sometimes they default to criticizing you, but eventually you give in. And you give in without even changing your convictions. You still believe the same thing, but you just want the pressure to stop. And that is surrender. But it is surrender for the sake of relief. Some of us know exactly how that feels. You've been in a situation where maybe you've tried to be calm. You've explained your side of the story over and over and over again, and yet They don't relent, and every part of you just wants the tension to end. And in that moment, compromise begins to feel easier. You tell yourself, this is not worth the fight. You decide that keeping peace matters more than sticking with your convictions. Because that pressure has trained you to believe that surrender is the only way peace will come. But another person's refusal to hear your yes or your no does not create a new obligation for you. Their persistence just reveals how costly that moment is, but it does not rewrite what is true. Sorry, I'm just chuckling to myself because I thought of this, and it's just been so true in my life and in the past, is that peace through disobedience is not peace. It's an escape. And the deeper problem is that we begin believing that we will not be okay while another person remains unhappy with us. Right? We think about it at nighttime before we go to bed. It bothers us. Their anger feels like maybe this is a crisis situation. Or if they are giving the silent treatment, maybe that's unbearable to you. But because we cannot control their response, sometimes what we do is we change our obedience instead. It's as truthful as I can say it. Sometimes we change our obedience instead. And that's what we're going to see here in verse 15. That people-pleasing sacrifices what is right. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for him Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Nothing new has been discovered. There's no new evidence. No new crime has been brought to the surface. The crowd has not answered Pilate's questions still, but Pilate still acts anyway. And Mark is very clear about his motive. He says, Pilate wishes to satisfy the crowd. So he releases Barabbas. Jesus is then scourged, his flesh ripped off, and he's handed over to be crucified. The crowd had an outcome. And they put so much pressure on Pilate that he gave in. But you know what the price was? It was justice. True justice. Barabbas, a man connected to the insurrection and murder, walks free. While Jesus, who the crowd had no evil against, no evidence, no arguments, is punished and handed over to die. Pilate does not just fail to reach the right decision. He knowingly and willingly carries out the wrong one. Think about how much has changed since Jesus first encountered Pilate. And that is the final danger of people-pleasing. That it can bring us to a place where we are no longer asking, how can I keep this person pleased? But it takes a step further, and it's, what am I willing to surrender in order to keep them pleased? It's a much different question. For Pilate, the answer is justice. He takes what he knows is right and exchanges it for something that he knows is wrong. But that is what compromise always does, right? It allows us to surrender what you and I know to be true. And there's going to be moments where we realize that keeping someone satisfied will require us to be dishonest. Keeping someone satisfied may cause us to excuse something they've done that we know is wrong. And at that moment, we are no longer deciding how to keep the peace. We are deciding whether what is right is worth protecting. And for you young people, man, I wish I would have known that when I was your age. You are going to have to fight to protect what you know is right. Something does not become less true just because someone you love disagrees with it. Something does not become less right because you may disappoint someone. And if Mark 15:15 shows us anything, it's that something that God has made clear to you and I should never be surrendered just because it would make your life easier. Amen.